Greetings.
Should I put a little more growl into it?
Okay, I came back to, we spent 48 hours making puppets.
Making and breaking hearts, Ellinger.
It's not that kind of podcast.
On a practical level, I have to remember what I was saying on a practical level.
We should have a safe word. Armageddon!
I guess we're maybe semi-proud of that.
Welcome to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop.
Welcome back to Hide and Create, your favorite writing-related podcast. With me, we have Moses Siregar, Joshua Essoe, and Jordan Ellinger, and I am Diana Rowland. I'll be hosting today, and today we're going to make you cry. Or rather, we're going to talk about making your readers cry, which there was some discussion beforehand about how I liked making people cry. So,
yeah, but she does it by hitting them in the face. So.
Yeah, right. So, making readers cry, basically, the way I look at this is you're making an emotional connection with your reader. And it doesn't have to be making them cry, but you want your reader to be emotionally connected to your book. You want them to feel... you want them basically to dance to your tune, to your emotional tune. You want them to cry and be happy and all that other stuff. And we're going to talk about how you can do that. Moses, would you like to start?
Yeah, I have to start with a confession, which is that, well, first of all, I cry a lot when I write, so I make myself cry really easily. This is kind of strange. 'Cause I'm not like a crier normally, but I actually have this weird feedback mechanism when I write. If I am not crying at times, then it kind of sucks. And if I'm crying, I'm like, oh, this is good. Like, it's weird. It's weird. Like, the emotion just comes through, and it's this kind of barometer that I have. So on the one hand, I want to say that, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. I don't know. But I guess apparently that doesn't work because my first book, I think my biggest disappointment with it was that I didn't make enough people cry. And so one of my biggest goals with my future books is to make people cry. So this is something I'm actively working on, and I hope to learn from you guys some things about this. But if I try to analyze why, even though I had like a very emotional type of story, a very dramatic type of story, why I didn't necessarily get that response from many readers. I mean, my first book was kind of this multiple point of view type of book. So it's an epic fantasy, big cast of characters. And there are characters that the readers definitely like. And I think the plot tends to pull them along really well. But I think it must have been that they needed an even deeper connection to some of those characters to get into that. And so, like, the next books I'm writing, I've made more of an effort to really get into the story for those particular characters and, like, their hopes and dreams, like, spending more time with it. I mean, I did that in the first book, but I think it needed more time to really simmer and just really get that attachment really strong. So I'm actually still working on this. And this is something that I'm going to try to learn from you guys about today.
I just want to put in that I cry while I'm writing all the time. So you're not that weird.
Okay, good.
My daughter will come in the room and say, Mom, what's wrong? I'm like, it's okay. It's just a really good scene. She just rolls her eyes and leaves. It's like, okay, whatever, Ma.
That's
Joshua.
I wanted to ask you guys, what are some stories that have made you cry? Okay, so I'll go first. When I was a kid and I read Where the Red Fern Grows, that book destroyed me. That book really screwed me up. And then
Flowers for Algernon.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Oh, my God. Sobbing for days after that one.
Wow. Yeah. You just made me think of The Yearling, which I read when I was...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was White Fang. That one got me. Not as bad.
Old Yeller. Anything where an animal dies.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, that's like a rule of writing is that, like many readers, I think 25% of readers will stop after the first dog dies, apparently. So David Hartwell, the editor of Tor, told us that in Clarion West. He was like,
wow. That
and babies or something. If you have a dog and a baby die, you lose like 50% of your readers. They're done.
You have to really, really, really justify. Well, that brings up a point then. Well, okay, so we have these books that have brought us to tears, and they're not all with animals dying, but even so, there are stories out there where animals die were not brought to tears. How do you build that emotional connection so that, even so, you're still building an emotional connection? Joshua, what have you seen in your work that you think works, doesn't work? What are some spectacular failures where you think people, this is supposed to be an emotional scene and I'm not feeling it? What do you think people are doing wrong sometimes?
I think really the thing that people are doing wrong sometimes is that they're not feeling it themselves. I mean, it's kind of like what Moses was saying in the opening here. If you want to make your readers cry, then you've got to touch something within yourself. So you want to frame the story with an emotion that you want to invoke. Ultimately, you want to ask yourself what moves you. We come back to writing what we know. To make your readers cry, I think that you have to reach deep down inside yourself and touch your own pain, touch your fear or your weakness or maybe your nightmares. All that stuff. That stuff is the fuel for your writing. That stuff is the spirit of what you need, because if you want your reader to feel, then you probably have to be brave and do it first.
I'm going to totally agree with you, because I have written down as one of my notes, and yes, I did actually take a few notes this time. If you're not emotionally connected, then your reader won't be. And it's not that, like, if you're talking about losing a child, not that you have to experience losing a child, but you have to be able to touch into that level of grief, or to at least be able to project and imagine what it would be like to lose a child or that sort of thing. So yes, completely agree.
Yeah, going back to what we were talking about with dogs and pets and animals and stuff a moment ago, there's a piece of flash fiction that I wrote that's up on my website called September 3rd that I still cannot read. I cannot read this thing because it's one of those things that when I wrote it, I was like, a quarter or half the way through, I was sobbing, and I had to write through racking sobs for the entire rest of the story.
We are a bunch of weenies. I love this.
I have to admit, I knew that my Red is the Future winning story would win after I cried the fourth time I read it. So every time, but I was still crying the fourth time I read it, right?
You know, my Red is the Future story, Schrodinger's Hummingbird, I wrote that it's about a woman who loses her child, but in a more complex method than just plain dying. I wrote that before I had kids, and I could not write that story now. I don't think I could actually do that now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I don't know. It'd be interesting. I'm actually a little too afraid to try yet. Maybe I will at some point, but it's a... I have read it after I had my child. I went back and read it. It was like, oh my God. This one, the rejection I'm proudest of that is Sheila Williams rejected it, saying, I have a 2-year-old and I just couldn't bear it. I was like,
oh, wow.
It's like, thank you, but really?
That's not really a rejection.
I know. And it ended up great. I mean, I definitely, the Writers of the Future thing ended up perfectly. But so, Jordan, how do you evoke big emotional reactions in your readers?
Well, as a tie-in writer, the reaction that I most try to evoke is cool. Wow, this is amazing, right? Tie-in writers...
That's a hard one to do. So how do you do that?
Well, sure, yeah. Generally, what you try to do is get the character... Often, you have to realize that readers are already emotionally attached to the characters that you're writing with, right? Like Gotrek and Felix is an incredibly famous duo from the Warhammer universe, and I've written several stories with them. And there's 13 novels with them already. They're not my characters, right? So there is that history of readers being invested in the character. And so the way that I can make them care the most is just be true to the voice of that character, do my research, get into the head of that character, and as long as they believe, right, as long as I write a character that's close to the one that they're familiar with, I can take advantage of that emotional resonance that they already have with that character, right? So generally, I'm just trying not to break what they already have.
So what you're saying, Jordan, is that you are not going to make your readers feel like girly men. You're going SNL on them, and you're going to pump them up.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely.
See, we needed video for that.
Yeah.
I definitely want that.
Yeah, Hans and Franz from Saturday Night Live. I remember that. That's dating you, though, because that's an older sketch. But
we've established I'm the oldest one here, so it's okay.
Yeah. So yeah, generally, I just not breaking what's there, and then try to add a little bit of depth to those characters, right? Try to make them grow, and as long as I'm true to that, readers will really appreciate that, and they'll have an emotional connection to the story because they'll think to themselves, "Oh, that's the one where Felix confronted his fear of being a bad writer," or that's
exciting.
No. It'll be some emotional growth. Oh, that's the story where Gotrek realize that a lot of the emotions that he has is because of this horrifying event that happened in his past, right? So that's the kind of connection that I try to make in tie-in fiction. For the Writers of the Future story that I ended up winning with, I think one of the best pieces of advice you can give somebody about how to create an emotional connection with your audience is, first of all, to know your audience, right? I said this last week, and I think it's very pertinent, today. Who's reading you, right? Who's reading and what do they care about, right? The audience of Warhammer is going to be very different from Diana's audience, for instance, right? And sure, there'll be a little bit of crossover, right?
No, I have to agree. There's probably it's a Venn diagram with two different.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's a very good example. But what is it about your readership? Like, what do they care about? Do they, want to see? Do they want to read about somebody's head getting hacked off and wow, that's cool, right? Or do they want to read about somebody saving their small child? And in Writers of the Future, that's what I went for, right? A mother and child. Now that's a very sympathetic bond, right? And that's something that generally everybody can empathize with, not just mothers and children.
Right, pretty much anyone, yeah.
Because everybody had a mother, right? And there are feelings that everybody has towards their mother. Even if you hate your mother, right? You have a terrible relationship with them. There are feelings that people have towards their mothers that you can exploit from when they were a small child. Generally, it's like there's kind of an instinctual bond that children have with their mothers, no matter what they feel on the surface.
Or even if they don't get along with their mother, they know the relationship they wanted to have with their mother.
Exactly.
Or something like that. So
that's very good. I really, that is
write it down. Just write it down.
That is the realization of the episode for me. Yeah, for sure. Like the thing that they wanted to have, they can get emotional about the relationship that they wanted to have with their mother or wanted to have with their father. It doesn't have to be the relationship that they had. But if you portray something like that, like the relationship that they wanted to have, they can get into that situation much more easily. And once they're into that situation, once they've projected themselves onto the protagonist, they're more emotionally invested. So
right, like everyone. I mean, everyone cheers when Mrs. Weasley kicks butt in the last book, right?
Yeah,
because she's the mom, and she's the mom in every aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Right. So you feel that connection, and you've projected yourself onto the main characters, right? So you feel that connection with Mrs. Weasley, and so you're able to get that kind of like emotional kick.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to go back to something that Moses had said earlier. He was talking about how he cried in his reading, but he was afraid that his readers weren't crying. So I wanted to talk about how to get that emotional connection when you've got it, but it's not quite getting through to your readers. The note I made here was that, okay, when that doesn't work, it might be a case of not putting enough of the character or conflict on the page. It's like, I know my character. I know everything about my characters, but that doesn't mean it's all getting onto the page. Or sometimes you have to figure out, why does this incident or conflict matter to the character? Moses, what have you done to try and solve this? I mean, have you explored options, or what feedback have you gotten from beta readers about this?
Well, I'm thinking about it again, and I've realized what I did is my first book, it's a standalone book, and the chapters are fairly short, and the pacing is fairly quick throughout the book, and the story moves along, and things happen, and that's, I think, what works better, is the plot and the story, the pacing, like, that works well. But
do you think the pacing's working against you, though, because we can't get invested?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Because I think there is, if you have the quick pacing with the good plot and that kind of stuff, like that kind of goes against, getting deep into the emotions and feelings of one character that you care about so much that you cry when something happens to them. Like the more characters you have, there's two things. I think the quicker the pacing is in the plot, it gets harder, and also the more characters you have, the harder it gets, because you have less time with any individual character to develop that bond.
Okay, I have a fix for that, sorta.
Well, yeah. So like the next book that I'm writing, like the first 50,000 words, it's already been published as The Children of Wind and Wood. If anyone reads that, it's like the first third of the next novel that I'm writing. But there are only 3 point of view characters, and they're all brothers and sisters. And generally, the chapters do go a little longer in some cases, and I put in more stuff to get you invested in their emotions, and I take my time a little more with it. I let it simmer a little more, and I have these like journal entries from them at times sometimes at the beginning of some of the chapters where you really get into their personal thoughts a little deeper. So I really am trying to get deeper in there. So again, it's fewer characters, more time to simmer with them, and really focusing on their story and their emotions. And it has been interesting that some of the reviews that I've gotten on this new one, they have said that the character development does seem deeper than the first book, and that's a conscious choice on my part to do that.
Okay, one of the things that I learned is scene and sequence, and I learned this actually from Laura Jo Rowland. She wrote. She was in one of my first writers groups, and people kept thinking we were sisters, which makes no sense because she's Chinese American and I'm not. But she writes these really neat mystery set in feudal Japan, and she used to go on and on about scene and sequence. Basically, you have the scene where something happens. Your next scene is the sequence of that scene, and in those sequences, those downturns, that's when you can really get into the reactions of everyone and into the personal feelings, and oh my god, this was so traumatic because of this and stuff like that. And so if you use that scene and sequence concept, you're not going to be slowing your pacing down that much, because people don't want to have action scene after action scene. It's exhausting. What I look at is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you ever mainline Buffy the Vampire Slayer off Netflix, you'll notice that Joss Whedon, he'll have like a really tense episode and then a lighter one. And then when there's a super, super tense one, he'll have a funny one after that. He's really, really good at judging when people need something to kind of ease that really, really heavy, heavy stuff. And that, I think, is a good way to look at chapters in a book too. You can have your big thing happening, and then something to let your reader catch their breath and get to know the people, and then have a big thing happen. And that way your readers don't get exhausted, and you still have solid pacing. So that's my lesson of the day.
Yeah, if I can comment on that. I've read books that talk about scene and sequence like that, where you have sort of the action chapter followed by the sort of reaction chapter. And I've seen debate about this. I've seen some writers say that you can't really get away with that anymore. Like that you do have to kind of pace things faster now. And
I think it doesn't have to be like one chapter, but you're going to have some kind of denouement from that action, and that's where you put your character stuff in, because the sequence, whether it's a whole chapter or even just a paragraph, it's their reactions and they're coming down off it, and that's where you put in they react to it, and it affects them because of this backstory, blah blah blah, real quick or whatever, and you can get your reader tied into a little more.
Right, and I think that's what I was going to say too, is that you can do it where it's paragraph to paragraph sometimes. It doesn't have to be chapter to chapter. And that was one thing I think I needed to do more of, was have more, even a sentence, even a paragraph of a character's reaction to something, where it's rather than making it big, but you do it gradually throughout.
Josh.
Sorry, you know what? I actually just wanted to jump in there.
Okay, go for it.
You know what? I don't think that people want pacing. I think they want intensity. The intensity needs to stay up through the entire novel, and one way of achieving intensity is with pacing. Right? If you keep it fast-paced, then it's always an intense read, right? But you can also get intensity simply through conflict, right? I hate the fact that I'm always bringing up movies as examples, but generally...
But they're good examples. It's storytelling. It's an easy way to show storytelling.
Yeah, many people have seen movies, and novels is... there are many more novels.
Redundant statement of the week.
Well, yeah, there are many more novels, right? So people may not have read all the novels. Movies, especially big-budget movies, people tend to have seen. So a couple of examples of this is The American with George Clooney, and the... shooting of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, or something like that. The assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. So those are both relatively medium budget films, but the pacing in those is incredibly slow. Like, it's really, 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 really slow. But every scene is very intense, right? One of my favorite scenes in movies is in the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. But the Jesse James character is just walks into this guy's house, right? Sits down, and the guy has betrayed Jesse James, right? And he is not a bright guy. He's got some kind of mental deficiency. So Jesse James sits down and just puts a gun on the table, right? And just starts talking to this guy. Just a regular conversation. How are you? How are you doing? And the audience knows that this guy, this not bright guy, has betrayed Jesse James, and you get the impression that Jesse James knows that too. And Jesse James in the movie is portrayed as a killer, and it's an incredibly intense scene when you think, when is Jesse James going to pick up that gun and shoot this guy, right? You know.
That reminds me a lot of Pulp Fiction in the beginning when Jules and what was Travolta's character's name? They go. Do you remember at the very beginning when they go in to get the briefcase back from those three dudes?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, same kind of scene right there, and that was really, really intense. And he's just talking to them. You can tell they're, freaked out of their minds. Mm-hmm. But he's just talking and talking until he gets to his big Bible speech, and they blow the crap out of everybody.
Yeah, but like that's a very slow-paced movie. Or not Pulp Fiction, sorry. But so The American and the Assassination of Jesse, yada yada. Those are two very slow-paced movies that are very intense, and they work despite their pacing.
Right, and I'd like to point out that the intensity is brought out by an emotional connection. You're sitting there, you're on the edge of your seat because you're invested. You're incredibly invested in what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Josh, talk to me. Make me cry. I know you have pages of notes there. Go ahead.
There was a couple of techniques that I wanted to talk about that you could include in your stories to help you make readers cry. And the first of those is, if you want to arouse an emotion in your readers, try the tripling technique, right, or the rule of three. Basically, it's very simple. You indicate an emotion over and over and over through different tools of storytelling and description. That way, you build up and enhance, the urge in your reader, hopefully to cry, or to be scared, or to be angry, or whatever it is that you're going for. And the other more subtle and I think more effective way to help make your readers cry is to frame the story with the emotion that you want to invoke. And I think I mentioned something like that earlier. But if the character is sad, for example, describe the setting in a way that reflects that, right? Oh, now I can't stop saying right.
You're infected.
Create an atmosphere that puts your reader in the right emotional frame. For example, if the buildings are shiny and your character is sad, your story is being told from a sad character POV, don't describe them as shiny. Describe them as slouching and gray or looming, filthy. Set your readers up for knocking them down. Put them in the right headspace first.
I think another way you can kind of generate an emotional response in readers, just speaking of that, is watching your cadence as you write. Right? Like you can really affect a reader's emotional state. For instance, if you have a lot of very short, choppy sentences, right, that can make it seem more like the action is more fast-paced, or more urgent, or more frantic. If you have longer pacing, right, you have longer sentences, maybe with more clauses, then it can feel a little bit more intense, like a slow build, right? And you can actually modify the cadence of your sentences to start with slower sentences with a lot of clauses and eventually move quicker and quicker and quicker. And I guess it's kind of like the soundtrack in movies, right? It's kind of a subtle emotional manipulation that you don't really notice, right? Mm-hmm. The reader won't really notice that, but they'll begin feeling that because of the way you choose your sentences.
And a good way to help yourself do this, sometimes you won't be able to get it done in a first draft or something like that. But if you go back and in your editing process, try syllabic editing. That'll really help you get those punchy, quick sentences. And
explain what you mean by that, please.
Oh, sure. So instead of having a sentence that's 5 words long and each word has 2 or 3 syllables in it, you find synonyms for those words and knock them down to a single syllable each. So you have, like Jordan was saying, a bunch of quick jabs instead of these long, drawn-out sounds. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you guys. I read every word in my head. I sound them out in my head. So stories have a definitive sound to me, not just the author's voice or anything like that.
That's a good point. As far as I go, I echo Moses. I definitely cry when I'm writing. I know when a scene's getting good when I'm just like bawling. But some of the things to keep in mind when you're trying to make the connection, whether you're wanting to make the reader cry or be happy or excited, whatever it is, you want to make sure that the stakes are personal to that character and that they really matter. Why does this incident or conflict matter to the character? If the character doesn't care, then why should the reader care?
I like what Jordan was saying about pacing, and you can have more character-oriented scenes, even internal, even in terms of scene and sequence. You can have that reaction type scene, but you can have that, and it's not necessarily slow pacing. It may be very riveting. In fact, if the reader is really invested in the character, they may be fascinated to hear about their reactions and their process and even their thoughts on things.
The reader has to be invested in the character. If you want emotional response, they have to be invested.
Yeah. And I think, I have an idea for a series I want to write after the series I'm currently writing. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'd love to write this other series someday. And this one would be a first-person story told from one character's point of view for like 3 books. And the structure kind of reminds me of the Kingkiller Chronicles, by Pat Rothfuss. And it's kind of a coming-of-age story. And it's like, I think it would be so much easier to create that emotional reaction in the reader by giving them that much time, with one character. In their head. And the whole idea for that series comes out of a very emotional thing in my life. So that I don't think should be too hard, right, to get that reaction. But the way I'm writing now, which is, big cast of characters, big story, big epic type thing, it's a challenge. And I think what I've had to allow myself to do is just breathe a little more, slow down, really give the characters their time and trust that the readers will, with that time, get that attachment to the characters and that it will just make everything better. And the pacing doesn't have to suffer from that. You can still keep the readers invested in turning the pages. You just have to slow down a little bit to really, really invest in the characters more.
I wanted to say that another way to help make your readers cry is to show how the survivors are traumatized by the loss of, perhaps a character dies and that's what's sad. So show how the survivors are traumatized. Yeah. Make sure that the other characters miss the deceased extraordinarily. And if you're able to, draw sympathy.
This is how you should feel.
Yeah, show them. Basically pave the way.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking of attachment to characters, we haven't really talked about this yet, but everybody's familiar with the concept of projection characters?
Why don't you explain, just to be sure?
So, projection characters is a character that you, the reader, project yourself onto. So, Keanu Reeves, for instance, as an actor, he's a projection actor, right? Keanu Reeves is a blank slate that readers can project themselves onto. He's not a character actor like Daniel Day-Lewis, who is very distinct in his roles. Keanu Reeves is basically Keanu Reeves in all of his roles, right?
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah, but he's this blank
But he's
slate.
Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, you can put yourself in his place in the movie. You can imagine that Keanu Reeves is you, right?
Yeah.
And
he's an Orson Scott Card character.
I was going to say Orson Scott Card does this very, very well in Ender's Game, which, again, despite whatever you think of Orson Scott Card's politics, Ender's Game is one of my favorite books of all time. And I was a bullied child, and I'm sure many of our listeners were in that situation as well, right? We weren't all the cool kids like Diana.
Yeah, we'll talk about my bullying sometime. We'll make that a whole episode.
Yeah. I know that might be an idea for a future show. But so readers of Ender's Game, Ender is a bullied child, right? And he is able to, just through sheer excellence, master all of his, everybody that's bullying him. He overcomes all of his bullies, and that's really powerful for a bullied child to read. So you have Ender, who's a bullied child. You can project yourself onto Ender, and then Ender goes ahead and succeeds wildly, and so you succeed along with him because you're along for the ride. You've projected yourself onto Ender. So what you can do to create a projection character is to create qualities that are common to an underclass, right? Somebody that is not the majority, right? A minority. So bullied people are a minority. Therefore, if you have a bullied character, it's very powerful and very easy for them to project themselves onto that character, right? So that's a very easy way of doing it. The other way, of course, is to just create a generic enough character that anybody can project themselves onto them, like Keanu Reeves, right?
So how does that relate to making your readers cry? Is it easier to make them cry with a projection character, or
yeah, because they've projected themselves onto that character, it's like the action is happening to them, right? Mm-hmm. Not to the character. It's like it's physically happening to them. So when the character suffers a loss, it's like it happened to them, right? You know, like this character has a great girlfriend, and that's something that maybe you've always wanted, and so you project yourself onto that character, and they get a great girlfriend, and then they lose them. It feels like you have lost a great girlfriend, right? So this character that you love and cherish has lost them, therefore you have lost them, and that creates the emotional attachment.
Okay, I got a question for all y'all. When you're writing, do you make faces? Do you if you're writing about people scowling or grimacing, do you sit there and scowl and grimace or make... Okay, I just... Fess up, Joshua. When you write, do you make faces?
Yes. No, I will get out of my chair and enact entire action scenes to figure out how body works and where people are in relation to each other. I'll
the
look
people
in the
at
mirror.
Starbucks wonder about you, don't they?
No comment. I will. I'll look in the mirror and see how a face, an expression might better be described, or how I could do it differently. Yeah, definitely.
See, for me, it's not so much like wanting to describe it better. It's just that I'm getting into it, and so she grimaced when she did this. I have a confession to make, but I'll make it after I hear from Moses and Joe Jordan about the making faces thing. Moses, do you make faces?
I would say I try to get into the entire emotion the character is going through. Like, I try to recreate that in myself. I make sure the doors are closed and the windows are, sealed. But yeah, like I have to try to get into the entire emotion, and so I'm probably walking around making all sorts of faces.
I get that when I'm rewriting, right? Okay. I generally just try to spew onto the page, and I only make one face actually when I spew, and that's my spew face. So, no, when I'm rewriting, I'm trying to add.
There's a delayed.
It's PG rated, man.
Yeah,
I know. I was thinking the same thing. Is that your O face, Joe?
Yeah. So no, when I'm going back and rewriting and trying to add depth and stuff, then I will be, then I'll make faces.
Okay, so not long ago, a couple years back, actually, my husband. I got Botox in corners of my eyes and right between my eyebrows. Okay, and I ended up hating it because I couldn't make faces while I wrote, and it screwed me up. It really screwed me up. I could not get into the emotion of the character because I couldn't, draw my brows down together and screw up my face and grimace and stuff like that. It drove me nuts. And I later read an article about how Botox was being used as a way to help treat depression, because if you couldn't make those frowny faces, you didn't actually feel it. And it was like, yes, you're right, you can't feel it. And it was really weird. And that's why I will never ever get Botox again. But that's my sordid confession. Okay, so it's time for closing thoughts.
Quickly ahead.
All right, Jordan.
Closing thoughts. All right. Well, you know what? I think all fiction, all art, in fact, exists purely to portray an emotion to the reader or the person enjoying the art, right? There's a reason that people give awards to fiction that provokes an emotional response, because it's so difficult, especially in our jaded world, to provoke an emotional response in people. People crave it, even if it's sadness, right? People want to be touched. They want to experience something in their lives. And as artists, it's up to us to do that. If you can give somebody a good cry, right, they will come back and read your fiction, right? If you can make them laugh, comedians get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to make people laugh, right? Make an emotional connection in your audience.
Moses, what you got?
So we've talked about how you want to, get into the emotion yourself, and I think you can go through your life and think about, the most emotional things that have ever happened to you, or any time you felt a very particular emotion, and this is where being honest with yourself and facing yourself is important, because you need to be able to look at your life, you need to be able to look at your past, you need to be able to see, oh yeah, there was that moment in my life, and how did I feel there? Because a lot of people don't want to confront their feelings, they don't want to get into those things, but as a writer, that's a gold mine waiting for you. You get into that feeling and go, yeah, that's how I felt, and I'm going to write a scene where I can just mine a little bit of that. So, be willing to go through your life and think about things that you can tap into and put that on the page, and your readers will benefit from it.
It's kind of like the silver lining of misery. It's like, okay, at least I can use it in a book.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I've gone through my life since I was around 18 years old. We moved away from everybody that I knew, all my friends, and just to a completely different state. And I went through a lot of emotional changes, and that was one of them, where everything that happens to you just ends up making a good story. So it's okay if crappy things happen to you, because then it just gives you more fuel for your writing fire. So my final thought really is just try and do this, essentially. Go ahead and write about that stuff that punches you right in the throat. If you make your readers cry, like Jordan was saying, you have a hit story on your hands, because people want to feel. Readers generally enjoy feeling so connected and so drawn into a world or characters that you've made that they feel real feelings. I mean, it's like taking drugs, same kind of thing. It's the epitome of escapism, to feel real things because of made-up stories.
We are your literary drug dealers.
Is right.
And on that note, I think we're going to close it out. Thanks for listening to us blather on in interesting and entertaining and emotional ways, of course. Until next week, bye-bye.
This has been another episode of Hide and Create. The show is produced by me, Jordan Ellinger. The site is edited by Joshua Essoe, and your co-hosts have been Diana Rowland and Moses Siregar. That music that you're listening to was written by Jason Donnelly. We can be reached at writingpodcastonline.com, where you can ask us questions and suggest topics for future shows. Thank you for listening. Now go hide and create something.